Mr. President, excuse me, I move for the adoption of minutes from our closed session held on Tuesday, July the 1st, 2014, and also minutes from the business meeting on the same date.
Is there a second?
Second?
Motion by Mr. Bailey, seconded by Mrs. Brightman to approve minutes. Are there any corrections or amendments to the minutes? If not, all those in favor of approval? Are there any opposed? Motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs. We don't have any individuals who've signed up to speak at public comment. Is there anybody here who'd like the opportunity? No. We'll move along then to old business. The first item under old business is the consideration of the second read to rescind policies IKA and IKC and to adopt new policy IKA.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hardings, board members. During the Board of Education's public business meeting conducted on June 3rd, 2014, the board approved a motion to rescind policy IKC. It also approved a motion to rescind existing policy IKA and a separate motion adopting new policy IKA entitled Grading System for Secondary Schools. The second reading, which was scheduled for June 17th, was deferred because the Board of Education received comments on the proposed new policy. The Policy Committee conducted a public work session on July 2nd, at which time the individual who submitted the comments was provided an opportunity to further explain her comments. A school staff member also provided comments. The members of the Policy Committee posed a number of questions during this work session. Based upon the information submitted to the Policy Committee at the public work session, it is recommending that the Board of Education take the following action. Adopt a motion to rescind policy IKC, adopt a motion to rescind policy IKA, adopt a motion to approve new policy IKA.
Thank you, Dr. Marco. Is there a motion?
Mr. President, I move for the approval of the second reading to rescind policy IKA entitled Grading System, High Schools and Middle Schools.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Fisher and seconded by Mrs. Brightman. Is there any discussion? If not, the question's on Mrs. Fisher's motion to rescind policy IKA entitled Grading System, High Schools and Middle Schools. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? Motion passes 6-1, and the student member concurs with the majority. Is there another motion?
Mr. President, I move for the approval of the second reading to rescind policy IKC entitled Class Rankings and Grade Point Average.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion by Mrs. Fisher and second by Mr. Bailey to approve the second read to rescind policy IKC. Is there any discussion? If not, all those, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Sure.
Yes, I have some concern on page 3 of 4, under B2, the last sentence. I think this policy is pretty clear and straightforward. I'm wondering about the latitude that's given by the phrases "in extenuating circumstances" and "grading issues." I'm wondering what kind of circumstances? I'm sorry, am I on the wrong policy?
Yes, the motion on the floor right now is to rescind policy
Oh, I'm
IKC.
so sorry.
That's okay.
I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Got ahead of myself. I apologize.
You gave us a preview. Things to come.
We're trying to find the page in
I
IKC.
am so sorry. I apologize. I thought we had already voted to rescind that. Sorry.
Is there any further discussion? If not, the question's on Mrs. Fisher's motion to rescind policy IKC. All those in favor? Any opposed? The motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs. Is there another motion?
Yes. This time I would like to move for the approval of the second reading to adopt new policy IKA entitled Grading System for Secondary Schools.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Fisher, second by Mrs. Harshman. Is there any discussion? Mrs. Williams?
Am I in the right time and the
You are-
right place?
you're on track
Okay,
now.
all right. I do apologize for that earlier misstep. Again, I'm looking at B2 on page 3 of 4. And as I said earlier, I think the policy is pretty clear and straightforward. My concern is about the latitude that the phrases "in extenuating circumstances" and grading issues. I'm wondering what kind of circumstances might the principal face that he or she would need to resolve. And I'm wondering about the need for oversight here. Should a principal declare an extenuating circumstance? Should a supervisor or a director be notified? Should there be some kind of documentation to affirm this type of decision? I'm just wondering if there should be a paper trail for the protection of all, the student, the principal, the parents, the system. So those are my questions, just wondering about that.
And I can certainly speak to the issue based on comments that Mr. Akers offered. That Mr. Akers offered to the policy committee early on in the process, and that is that this would only arise in very limited types of circumstances where a student might be facing some health issues or some unique family issues that a school principal would be aware of. And he believed that in those circumstances, we should afford a school principal the discretion to not have hard and fast rules, but to allow some flexibility in those limited circumstances. He didn't indicate that this is something that you would see on a regular basis every school year, but there are occasions where we have to take into consideration the obstacles that students are facing that are beyond their control, and he felt the school principal was in the best position to assess the situation and then to make a decision. We certainly can carry back to him that, and to Dr. Domain, and Dr. Domain is here today, that we make the message loud and clear to principals that they should be conferring with their immediate supervisor if they're inclined to grant that type of leniency in an extraordinary situation.
I have something
Harshman?
about this particular issue. As a former teacher, this can raise all kinds of problems for a teacher whose grade is then changed by a principal and whose name is on the report card. I know of an instance where this happened to 3 teachers, and all 3 requested that their names be taken off the report card because that was not the grade the student earned in the class. So is there a provision for that? Because I know as a teacher, I would not want my name on a grade that I did not issue.
I can only share, I do not recall any specific conversation or comments offered on that particular point. We certainly could take that back to Mr. Akers and to Dr. Domain.
Are there other comments? Mr. Ryder?
I apologize. My voice is not real good. I will not support this again for the same reason as first read. I still do not like the disconnect between final exams, that one set of students do not have them and another set do, whether it's 10%, 5%, whatever the case might be. One size should fit all or not at all. So I'm not going to support this with that provision still in there.
Mrs. Bright?
And to that point, Mr. Ridenour, I read that over in the 2 weeks or so that we've gone from first read to second, and I understand the concern. Help me understand, I mean, we don't use PARCC assessment outcomes to average in any of our students' grades, right?
That's correct.
So here, the final exams count for no less than 10, no more than 20%, but if you're assessed, and I assume once the assessments at high school, we still have the HSAs right now, correct?
We're transitioning away from the HSAs.
But
next
it'll another-
year,
is it
I believe
another
the
year?
ninth grade going into 10th grade will have to continue to take HSAs, but the ninth graders, eighth graders entering ninth grade will not have the HSAs, my understanding of it at this point. They will be all park.
They will be all park.
That is my understanding.
In just the 2 subjects or all 4? Or
I believe it's all-
major?
I believe it's all 4,
Science and,
but I would probably seek some clarification. That's at least my understanding at this point, Mrs. Bright.
was this discussed in the policy committee as far as that inconsistency between a final exam versus a park? Do you know how staff may,
I don't recall discussions about that particular point. I do recall discussions regarding whether some students took a final exam and others did not. And my recollection is, and I welcome comments from the members of the policy committee, that Mr. Akers indicated when you look at the potential for there being any significant difference, he didn't believe that would be the case. But I do not recall the question you posed being discussed.
so a student who takes park wouldn't have a final exam and the park assessment? It would be an either-or.
That would be my understanding, yes, that there would not be a duplication of assessment with a final exam and a park exam.
I think that was the understanding of the committee,
Yes.
I think, was that if you take a park exam in a particular subject, then you don't take a final exam. That's
But the final exam counts, but the park
park
doesn't.
that's correct.
Okay.
I think that may have been from the issue of the kids taking so many tests at the end of the year, because if they took like the park or the state tests, then they still had final exams and they still had something else. I gave 3 tests within 2 weeks at the end of one year, which was unbelievable. I don't know how they did on the third one. I can't remember what it was, but I think that's how that came about, that it was an either-or situation, so that they were not taking all those tests at the end.
And I understand that perspective. Seems unequal to me. But moving on, the last page, page 4 when we're talking about non-weighted, accelerated quality point values and so forth. And I'm not sure if, Dr. Marco, if you can answer this, or maybe Dr. Domain, but how are we going to handle middle college grades? Dual enrollment, classes taught by, we're looking at, these boutique schools and some of these other type of apprenticeships and internships. Once we start going in this more creative, non-traditional direction, how do those grades get weighted? Because if I understand correct, middle school, you get a high school diploma plus an AA from the institution. So how would we calculate the grade point average and quality points if the class is being taught at HCC in this situation by an instructor employed by HCC? How do we have quality control or equity there?
I have not been part of a conversation regarding that, Mrs. Brightman. I don't know if Mr. Akers or Dr. Domain would be able to
I think she's
provide additional
coming
insight.
up.
Good afternoon. Our discussion has been regarding those courses. I know that we cannot get in and assess or evaluate a class that is taken at HCC, but looking at the content and the requirements for those students who are taking those classes, we are, in good faith, believe that our kids are getting an experience that is rigorous and that is challenging. Our last conversation regarding how we will handle those grades, I believe that kids would get the weighted credit, the honors weighted credit, I think, for taking those courses, for being dually enrolled in those courses.
Can I dovetail
Yeah,
a question, Mrs.
go ahead,
Brighton?
sure.
Dr. Nami, I appreciate that. here's my problem with that, if you don't mind. I'm basically hearing that they would get the weighted or accelerated quality point. We have one level to the right of that, which is the advanced placement quality point average. Advanced placement classes, by their nature, are entry-level college courses. Why then, if a student is taking a college course, would they, and pass it, not get the advanced placement quality point value? I mean, to me, that just doesn't, it kind of,
I understand your question. Again, I need to double-check with Mr. Akers. I don't know if it's, at this point, I can't recall if it's the accelerated quality point value or the advanced placement. I believe that it's the accelerated quality point value. We also realized that we maybe, we didn't want to cream our AP courses. We also, want our students to still be interested in taking the advanced placement courses that we offer. And there has been some discussion about even the rigor of the AP classes versus even some of the courses that they may enroll in at some of the other, colleges that they may, that students may choose to attend. We've debated that. I'll have to talk with Mr. Akers again and see whether, we have settled on which scale.
I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and obviously we want our kids to take our classes. I mean, that just, our egos are that large, I'm sure, but by the same token, I mean, if it's an entry level, it's not a 100. I'm not talking about the sub 100s,
Correct.
I'm talking about, a first year entry level survey, psychology or history or whatever the case might be. For all intents and purposes, that's what an AP class should be. And if they're taking that instead of our AP class, they should be getting the same thing.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so, okay, thank you.
We will revisit that.
I appreciate you doing
We will revisit
that.
that.
I think that's important for our kids to know, and I think it might step on a few toes at the institutions where they're taking those courses
Yes,
if we're not saying the same thing.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
And just to finish my thought, and thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Ridenour.
Donna.
Yeah, as we go forward with more non-traditional type of classes and academic offerings and programs, it seems like we may have to revisit how we grade and how we value and how we weight. I don't know how you would value an apprenticeship where a student works half the day for a company and how do we value that with an AP, with a 101 level at I just think things are going to get kind of interesting, and I'm not sure how staff is thinking about this, but I have a feeling we're going to be back here.
Yes, ma'am. We are talking about that, and then, we have quite a few other options that students are making us consider at this point on earning credit. We're having those discussions now among, starting with the supervisors, just trying to understand what has been our practice, what can we see kind of on the horizon coming. So we are beginning those discussions. We have not reached any conclusions yet. We will bring them through the appropriate committees and, of course, before the board, as well as getting input from some parents who have brought those things to our minds. So we are thinking of those things now.
Particularly even virtual high school if you
Yes,
take a
ma'am.
class. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Mrs. Harshman?
On page 2 at the top, I had a question where it says, final grades will be based on the average of the 4 grade reports for year-long courses, 2 grade reports for semester-long courses. and 1 grade report for partial semester courses. And now, I don't know of any partial, but I'm sure there must be some, but with the 2 grades, is that not cutting that kind of close with a semester, that you only have 2 grades to average 2 time? I mean, you only have 2 to give you your final grade for that semester course. I know that before, when we had semesters, we had 3 grading periods. So it's cut back to 2. Is that giving the students the opportunity to increase their scores if they sort of mess up on a grading period?
I would see those as checkpoints along the way with the culmination of the different grades the teacher assigns during the course of the year, if I'm following you correctly, Mrs. Harshman. So that throughout the semester, students would be aware of what their grade is, but there would be 2 checkpoints along the way for the determination of the final grade.
Did we do that this year? Did we use 2 grading periods for the semesters, or did we still use 3?
I believe we used to.
2?
Yes,
And there was no problem with that?
not to my knowledge.
Okay. And then over on the next page, page 3, in that number 2 down, it also says, let's see, any student requested course change after the 5th class period of the course will be recorded, I guess that's as a course change, after the 5th class of the course. But what I'm wondering there is that gonna, 5th class of a semester, isn't that pretty far into the semester? That's a week of just a semester gone. Is that too many to allow, if that's all you get for a full year?
I believe that would allow the student to have at least a firm understanding of the expectations of the course and as determine whether or not it is in fact something that he or she would like to continue to pursue. I don't think it's too
If it
far.
is a semester course, though, would the student be able to pick up another class in place of that after missing 5 classes of?
I believe so, yes.
So you could still transfer to another class?
That would be my understanding, yes.
Okay. And I had one question on the back page where it said the process for designation of valedictorian and salutatorian is set forth in policy and so on. And what I was wondering is, has the computer program for that been set up now that they do not have to enter that in by hand like they did this year, because the final grade could not be entered in for the seniors before everyone else? Is that set up?
I would have to consult with Mr. Hammond or Dr. Michael to do that. I can get you that information, but I don't have it at this time.
Sorry, it'll be X for the first and fifth, and the calculation will be based on that.
So that's not going to cause a problem next year?
It will take away the counts, some counts for that issue.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Are there other comments?
Just a question, if I may. Synergy at this point, I mean, we are now, I think by contract, teachers are to put their grades in how often?
Every 2 weeks.
Every 2
is the new
weeks?
contract language,
So
yes.
students, parents, anyone else will have the opportunity to access and get their grades every 2 weeks at the worst.
That's correct, Mr. Reinhardt.
Okay, so, the interims to me are somewhat redundant, although they are, to me, still important because there are people who still don't want to access Synergy, which makes very little sense to me, but that's beside the point. So we do have that in place. We're not going to have to worry that people, don't know what's going on if they take the time to look at it.
Correct. It'll be
Okay.
very accessible, more so
Okay.
than ever with Synergy at this point.
I want, just for clarification from my point about the final exams, and I'm not, believe me, I'm not proposing that we add one for those people that take the park. What I'm saying is I don't see the need for those that don't have a park. for a marking period, you will have, most teachers will have numerous grades, and they will have unit grades and so on and so forth. It just seems to me that it's something that's unnecessary at this point in time. So that is my problem with it. Not finals themselves, not that we should give them to people who take the park. I just think there should be a consistency across the board. I don't see a need for them anymore. Thank you.
Are there any other comments? If not, the question's on Mrs. Fisher's motion to approve the second read of policy IKA. All those in favor? Those opposed? Motion passes 4-3, and the student member concurs with the majority. That brings us to the second item under old business, which is consideration of the second read to rescind policy BI and to adopt policy BJ.
On June the 3rd, the Board of Education approved the first reading of the rescission of policy BI, and it also approved the proposed adoption of new policy BJ entitled School Board Legislative Program. During the first reading, comments were offered that the Policy Committee considered during its public work session conducted on June 24th. Many of the changes that were offered were adopted by the Policy Committee. At this time, the Policy Committee is recommending the rescission of policy BI and the adoption of new policy BJ. Thank you.
Is there a motion?
Mr. President, I move for the approval of the second reading to rescind policy BI entitled School Board Legislative Program.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Fisher, seconded by Mrs. Brightman to approve the second read to rescind policy BI. Is there any discussion? If not, all those in favor? Yep,
Sorry, I'm not fast enough
that's okay,
there.
that's okay.
I had expressed some concern at our first read with regard to this policy, and I'm wondering if we could consider a number 8 on, under,
Just to be clear, this is the,
This is
the
rescind.
motion on the floor is the motion to rescind.
We're just checking.
I'm just making, I don't make the motion, I just report it.
I am so sorry.
That's okay. Is there any other discussion on the motion to rescind? If not, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs. Is there a motion?
Mr. President, I move for the approval of the second reading to adopt policy BJ entitled School Board Legislative Program.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Fisher, seconded by Mrs. Brightman to adopt policy BJ. Is there any discussion? I'm going to come back here and then, Mrs. Williams?
Welcome to my comedy
Either
of
way, it
errors
doesn't
here.
matter. Your enthusiasm does not go unrecognized, so you take the floor first.
Thank you, Dr. Hardings. Okay. As I said, I had expressed some concern at the first read, and I'm wondering if we might not consider, or if we might consider a number 8 under the policy statement, and that would allow for the full board to vote to affirm any positions taken on a legislative proposal or the modification of a position. That would just kind of bring things, it's, the last thing here says that the LRT would provide a report to the board, but I'm asking that we consider then having the full board affirm that position or any modification of a position. Just looking for thoughts with regard to that.
So,
Just a point of order, I think you need to make a motion to amend. To,
Okay.
If you'd
you know,
like
a
If
motion
I'd like to do that,
If you want to-
rather than to discuss that possibility.
Right.
Okay.
And then we
Because
can
if you make a
discuss.
motion to amend, then the
Then we can
discussion
di-
will be on
All
your
right.
on
amendment.
that amendment.
Okay, so,
Go for it.
all right. Mr. President, I would like to move to amend policy BJ to include a number 8 under the policy statement to read, "The Board of Education will vote to affirm any positions taken on any legislative proposal or the modification of any position taken."
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Williams, seconded by Mrs. Harshman. Is there any discussion? You have the right to speak first to your amendment, but if you want to say anything further than what you've said already.
Okay. No, just that I'm looking for
Okay.
some discussion there.
Mrs. Fisher?
On item 6 of Roman numeral 4, it says, "Based on the Board of Education's legislative core values," which the whole board, of course, decides, "and their legislative priorities," which also have been decided by the full board, "the LRT will take positions on proposed legislation on behalf of the board and communicate those positions to lawmakers." Because these decisions are based on the core values that the whole board has decided and the legislative priorities, and in addition to that, the idea that very often reactions need to occur very quickly because things happen so quickly sometimes down in the legislature. I don't know if there would always be time to wait until a board meeting to acquire that approval by the entire board. I thought that was part of the reason for having the LRT to start with. And since, as I said, they're already based on these two very basic decisions the board has made, I'm not so sure I see a need for the board to do that.
Is there other discussion? Mrs. Harshman?
Well, I think it's always important to feel as though you've been heard on any subject, whether or not it passes in your favor. So when something is put out there, we would not have to wait till a board meeting to get a consensus or a vote. If, you could call in the troops and at least get a quorum to vote. Most of us live close enough that if we wanted to call a special meeting, we could get here. And if we couldn't, then we could go on with whatever decision has been made. But I know that most people like to have some input, so I would be in favor of adding this to the policy.
That would
Mrs.
have to be a public meeting, wouldn't it?
Yes, if we were to come together to vote, we'd have to have a
Which
public
would
meeting.
require public announcement and time for the public to know
Public
whether a
notice.
meeting would occur. And by that time, might be
Have
too
we
late.
ever had that happen? Have we ever had something happen so fast that we would not have had time to do that?
Well,
I
I'll defer to
don't-
Mrs.
I
Brightman,
don't know. I don't
who's
remember.
the one mostly monitoring what goes on in Annapolis.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I would say that last session, and Mr. Trotta and the quick response team at that point, there were several occasions where decisions were called upon and action was needed, I would say, that day, that same day. And the comfort level of acting in the interest of the board was that we had already had the work session and all voted on the legislative core values and the legislative priorities. And the particular actions fit within the framework of what we had already supported. And I would just suggest that if we were to, and I'll give an example, Anne Arundel had a very similar discussion on this a few years ago, and it actually became so cumbersome to try to come back together as a full body that they missed several opportunities, and the whole idea of a legislative quick response team just didn't work. It failed to serve its purpose. And they have now just recently gone back again and said, we need to have a way of reacting quickly. So they've already tried what I think the amendment is suggesting, or something close to this, and they found it was very cumbersome. So I will just share that perspective with you.
Are there other comments on the amendment? Personally, I think as we talked about in the policy committee and as I discussed during first read, as I originally drafted this policy, I tried to make it structured so that the full board would come together to develop direction for the legislative session. We would then allow Tony and the superintendent and the members of this team to work to implement that with a regular report back to the full board on what they're doing. Because I thought that provided the authority from the board to do it, but it also involved a measure of accountability in the group coming back to the board every time the board met to let the board know what they had done. The mechanism then so there's a couple of things that could happen once the report comes back. Either the board could then consider and vote on every single thing that the response team took a position on or expressed an opinion on, or, which is I think what you're proposing, Mrs. Williams, or the response team could come back and report on all the things that they've taken a position on. And if at any time any member wants to make a motion that says, I move that the board take such and such a position on this issue, and it could be an issue that we've taken a position on, then that's a motion on the floor. It could be seconded, and the board could vote and reverse direction. So it's a matter of whether every time the legislative response team takes a position, you want to come back and have a vote on that, or an opportunity when we come back to report, as there would be with the existing policy, whether there's an opportunity for the board to put the brakes on. And I structured it in the latter way, not the former way.
So can an issue be brought back and changed after that? In other words, if the position had to be taken right that day or without anybody
Right.
meeting, how do you then change your decision if that's what the board would
You would have to
decide?
get in touch with the lawmakers in Annapolis and tell them that the board has changed its mind. But I think that is exactly the crux of what the challenge is, because if we want to be relevant to the discussion, we have to be set up in a way that we can react quickly to amendments and propose new language. But there's not really a way to do that and also have all 7 members weigh in on every decision. So that's the crux of the challenge that I think, at least I was trying to address in this policy. And if I haven't struck the right balance, then, let's go back to the drawing board. But are there any other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on Mrs. Williams' amendment to add a 4-8 to the policy requiring a vote on positions that the legislative response team has taken. Is that a fair statement of the amendment? Okay. All those in favor of the amendment? All those opposed? The motion fails, 2 in favor, 5 opposed, with the student member opposed. That returns us to the original policy. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Ridenour?
Yes, Mr. President, I would like to offer an amendment also. I'd like to amend Section 4, Number 2. The LTR will be comprised of the board president, at least one other board member, superintendent, the chief legal counsel, and the designated legislative representative. No case will there be more than 3 board members. I'd like to amend that to say the LTR will be comprised of the Board of Education president or his designee, and continue the remainder of the section as it is.
Okay, motion by Mr. Ridenour. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Bailey. So, Mr. Ridenour, you have the right to speak first to your amendment.
It's a simple one. It's not huge. It doesn't take away from what has been placed in this policy. It's a good policy, one that's definitely needed in today's political climate. Things do happen very quickly, as was mentioned before. But I believe that sometimes imposing that, it's not an imposition, but it is adding a duty to the president that may be something that he or she is not as comfortable with as they are in other areas, and would allow for another person who may be a little more comfortable with legislative activity to take that position as a designee. It's the only reason for it. I don't think it changes anything. I don't think it changes I mean, obviously, the president is the spokesperson, but that, I just think that we can get along and do equally well with a designee that has the type of experience and passion about legislative actions as we can possibly get in there.
Is there other discussion, Mrs. Fisher?
We had this discussion at the policy committee meeting, this exact discussion. In fact, I believe I'm the one who had suggested adding, or the board president's designee, but we talked about it for a while, and we decided since the board president is, and you mentioned this also, the spokesperson for the board, that we felt that should become a duty of the board president.
I just don't agree, that's all.
Okay, yeah, I'm just
It's not a big
explaining.
deal. I don't disagree, I disagree because I think we can get the same thing done with a designee that has the experience and maybe even better. I mean, I made my jaunts down to Annapolis, and I thought I did fairly well. I'm not as comfortable with it as, say, Mrs. Brightman. I would much rather have her represent us in Annapolis than myself. So whether she's in the chair, or I'm in the chair, or anyone else is in the chair, that would be my choice. So I'm not saying I'm just saying that I think, you know, you can put somebody there, but if they don't have the passion for it, as another person, I think it's not going to get done as well.
Is there other discussion? Mrs. Brightman?
Question, under that scenario, my concern is, would someone, a designee, have the same authority to go down to Annapolis to actually represent the board, to meet with peer-level elected officials? Would there be confusion by the delegation as to the authority of this person as a non-officer? So I guess that's where I'm leaning toward that importance of having that position.
Well, I understand, Mrs. Brightman, I appreciate that and understand that. But I think our delegation understands who and what that individual, we would make them fully aware that these are the people that are on this team. I think they won't know these are the members of our legislative response team, and they can expect calls from them in regards to issues as they come up. I don't think the title in front of a person's name is going to make any difference. The team itself, you know, we're going to have other people, you know, if, let's say, for example, if you and Justin were both on that team at this point in time, which for all intents and purposes you are, when you call them, they know what you're calling about and for whom you're speaking. And you're not the board president. So I don't see that as a problem. You know, it's the team that we're putting together. If the superintendent calls, he's going to have the same authority, or if our legislative representative calls, the same impact. I don't see that as a problem. I understand where you're coming from, and I appreciate that, but I don't see it as a problem.
I'll just add for myself, as Mrs. Fisher said, we did have a long discussion on this in the policy committee, and in addition to what she said, where I sort of came down was, it says the Board of Education president, at least one other board member, and perhaps two. So I think in a case where maybe it's not the president's strong suit or not something the president wants to engage fully in, the president has the opportunity to recommend to the board two other board members to serve on the committee with the president who may have that passion and that drive. So that it might work somewhat like it did this year. I spent as much time as I could, but Mrs. Brightman spent more time than I did. So that's where I thought it was worth having the president as part of the committee, but with giving the flexibility to appoint two members who might have the passion and carry that energy forward, like the legislative liaison to MABE or something that that's where I sort of came down where it is. But believe me, we had a good, robust discussion about it, and I think I could see it absolutely both
I
ways.
was supporting the amendment simply because I felt that it offered a little bit more flexibility and would give the president more of an opportunity. But you have clarified for me in the last couple of minutes here that if you need someone who is a specialist or has special knowledge in an area and serves on the board, you can pool that person to be the representative as part of this policy as written. So that's clarified it for me. I recall the legislation on athletics, the start of the season. You know, and there were people on the board who were uncomfortable with that issue and didn't know a whole lot about it. But if someone, you know, who had a background in it was available to go and testify at the state legislature, then that person was our best representative. So, but I understand now where the policy is flexible enough to allow you to do that.
Is there any other discussion? Not the questions on Mr. Ridenhour's amendment to add the words "or designee" to section 4.2 of the policy after Board of Education president. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? Motion fails. 1 in favor, 6 opposed. The student member opposed. Is there any other discussion? There's no other discussion. The question is on Mrs. Fisher's motion to approve the second read of policy BJ, legislative program. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? Motion passes 5-2, and the student member concurs with the majority. Thank you, gentlemen. That brings us to new business, the consent agenda.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hardings and members of the board. We have a total of 8 items on the consent agenda for your consideration this afternoon. I'm going to do a quick overview of each one of those and then open the meeting for you for questions. The first item is a solicitation for bids for commercial storage and delivery of food products. Washington County Public Schools has in the past utilized a company at fixed unit prices for the receiving, storage, inventory, handling, and delivery of food products to our schools that are ordered by the Food and Nutrition Services Department. These are items that we aren't purchasing under the Premier U.S. Delivery contract that the board authorized at several meetings ago. The contract will be effective upon the board approval through June 30 of 2015, and it does include options for annual extension thereafter. The Food Service Department estimates that they receive and distribute about 20,000 cases of food annually and have a requirement for storage of about 2,000 cases per month on average throughout the school year. Acela Distribution and Warehousing has successfully provided these services to the school system over the past several years and is recommended again to go forward and continue to serve our schools. The second item on the agenda is some design work for some mechanical equipment at Washington County Technical High School. Quotation proposals were solicited from those companies that were awarded mechanical design work under the bid 2013-33 on-call architectural and engineering services. The lowest quotation proposal was submitted by RHL Engineering, and we are recommending them for this design work. The third item is our wireless network access requisition for Bester Elementary School. The wireless network access equipment is being recommended to Bell TechLogic, utilizing pricing from a Baltimore County Public Schools contract. The total of that order is $71,847.29. Fourth on the agenda is a recommendation to renew a contract with Bimbo Foods for fresh bread and rolls that are delivered to our schools as a result of a cooperative bid that was issued last year by Frederick Schools that included Washington County Public Schools requirements as well. So this is technically a renewal of a bid that was awarded last year. Bimbo Foods has provided their same unit prices that we paid last year under this approaching renewal period, and they have serviced the schools very well. Fifth on the agenda are measures of academic proficiency testing. This is a sole source purchase. Northwest Evaluation Association developed these tests and provides the school system with all the materials and product support. The instructional staff is recommending that Washington County Public Schools continue to purchase and administer MAP testing countywide in grades K through 8. The total of that order is $191,050. Sixth on your agenda is a purchase of 250 laptop computers from Hartford Computer Group. They're IBM ThinkPad L440 CTO laptop computers with warranty, and the total of that purchase is $165,000. Seventh on the agenda is an order for Microsoft software renewal. This is an annual order. It includes all of the Microsoft software products that are used system-wide throughout the school district. This is the best pricing that's available to the school district that I'm aware of under the MEEC contract. The requisition total is $167,558.60. Last under the consent agenda, by an amendment to the packet I put together, is the contract between Meritus Medical Center and Washington County Board of Education to administer and provide all of the services that are used for our school health services program. It includes the staffing model and plan, as well as the responsibilities of the parties to continue to work with Meritus Medical Center for providing student health services for the 2014-2015 school year. That concludes my part of the presentation. If you have any questions, there are lots of folks here that are ready, willing, and able to help.
Is there a motion?
Mr. President, I would like to move to approve the bids for storage and delivery of food products to Acela Warehousing Incorporated in an estimated total of $57,800. Design HU/RTU improvements at Washington County Technical High School to RHL Engineering at $76,940. Wireless network access for Bester Elementary School to Bell Technologics Incorporated at $71,847.29. Renew bread and rolls to Bimbo Foods at unit prices. Measures of academic progress test to Northwest Evaluation Association at $191,050. 250 laptop computers to Hartford Computer Group Incorporated at $165,000, and Microsoft software renewal to Bell Technologics at $167,588.60. And our eighth proposal to approve the professional service agreement with Meritus Medical Incorporated for school health services for the 2014-15 school year at $2,914,325.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Mr. Bailey and seconded by Mr. Ridenhour. Is there any discussion? Mrs. Williams?
Yes, I wanted to ask some questions about the MAP testing. I don't know if you'll need Dr. Domain. This is something that we'll be using now for the second school year, I believe. And I was just wondering as to the process that went into choosing this. I've been told there are some alignment issues, and that at some grade levels, teachers have had to spend time teaching things that are not aligned with the standards in order for the students to progress and do better on the MAPS testing. So in fact, they would be teaching to that test. And so I'm wondering if this is in fact the program of testing that we should be using, or if perhaps there is something better aligned that we could be using. I know Frederick County has something, and I'm sorry I didn't make note of what that is, but I do know that there are other products out there. So those are my questions, Dr. Domain.
Okay, yes, ma'am. First, let me say that we started the school year with a very consistent message that we are doing the Maryland College and Career Ready standards. We would not take time away to teach to a test. We want our kids prepared very well and with meaningful learning experiences that are not geared for any specific assessment. So that should not have happened, taking any time away to prepare for a particular test. As I understand it, with the MAP test here in Washington County, this upcoming year will be the third year that it has been in place, and so therefore it's valuable, I know, for me, for teachers, for principals. Because it has been in place, we can make some comparisons over time regarding the performance of our students. When we say that we are teaching the standards, we understand them to be more rigorous than what we previously had in place. And so the thinking is, if we're teaching to more rigorous standards, then our students should be able to perform on these, I guess at the very least, basic skills that are in place and that are required by the MAP testing that it's measuring. We have asked teachers, to do what they do with all assessment results. A good thing about the MAP testing is that it is done frequently, the fall, the winter, the spring, and so we can measure students' growth, not just achievement at the end of the year, but throughout the year we have checkpoints where teachers can see where their students are and students can see where they themselves are, how they are progressing throughout the year. So, that's another good thing. We have also tied the district SLO to the results of the MAP test. So, in short, right now, this is the best product for us. We're going to continue with it. The superintendent and the executive staff have started talking about, is there something better down the line for us to use? But for right now, it is the MAP that we are using. The information that we get is valuable, but we never intended for any teacher to stop teaching to teach to any particular test.
Can I
Sure.
ask a follow-up?
Kara, please do.
So you mentioned that these are then tied to the SLOs and to eventually the teachers' evaluations. So if teachers need to show that students are progressing and meeting those SLOs, and in order to do that, they need to perform to a certain measure on a MAPS, wouldn't it be necessary to fill in the gaps so that the kids can then perform appropriately on the MAPS? I mean, I understand the message that you say you're sending, that we're not going to teach something specifically for the test, and yet in reality, I know that this is the measurement that's tied to the SLOs, that's tied to eventually the students' or the teacher's evaluation. So,
I know that there may be some skills, some particular skill that may not be specifically taught, but I think that it's embedded in what they're doing. And for instance, Ms. Williams, when I think about measuring reading, I mean, it's a test of reading and math. When we look at reading, there's only so many ways that you can test reading comprehension. The question may be asked a little, we know that it will be asked a little differently. We know that on the part, it's going to be not just reading a particular passage, but reading multiple passages and having students come to conclusions about that. Well, that is not a requirement of MAP. So again, just because we're telling teachers don't focus on a particular test, just teach and teach well. We believe that, students are going to perform. And again, I think that's the value in the multiple times that students have the opportunity to show what they know. If teachers see that their kids aren't progressing in a particular area, then, as you would with any other assessment, as you would with, a teacher-made assessment, take the time to address that. But again, we say don't teach to a test.
thank you.
Mrs. Harshman?
I've been hearing basically the same thing, which is that the MAP test does not correspond to the curriculum. I don't know where the problem is or where the difference is or what's happening, and maybe we could look at that in the Curriculum and Instruction Committee. But I have been hearing exactly the same thing.
Yes, ma'am. We know, again, that there is some misalignment. The standards have been evolving, and our tests, the testing program that was adopted in 2012 cannot align completely with the standards that, may have evolved even over the past year. We understand that there is some misalignment, but again, we're looking for simply good teaching, and we believe that the common Maryland's Career and College Ready standards provides a framework for that to happen. But yes, that is something that we can address in the Curriculum and Instruction Committee. I'll put that on our agenda.
Have we checked with, what did you say, Mrs. Williams, Frederick County? Have we checked with what they're doing?
That's what it is, Global Scholar. Is that better aligned? What was the selection process that went into Washington County deciding to use MAP and not, say, Global Scholar? Or how was that decision made, Dr. Marco?
When we first adopted MAPS, it was for the Teacher Incentive Fund because we needed a measurable benchmark in terms of compensating the teachers. We looked at Montgomery County at the time, which is using, I believe continues to use MAPS. It has been my understanding initially when we adopted MAPS, it was aligned to the MSA. Now, MAPS would tell you today that it is more aligned to Common Core state standards. Some supervisors would argue that's not 100% accurate, but there is an attempt by the organization to build in the different components of the Common Core state standards. So there is that involved. Historically, what we really wanted to do with MAPS, and we recognize that there will be a sunset for MAPS just as we transition to PARC and make sure that we have assessments that mirror PARC. MAPS doesn't necessarily do that. It's the closest thing that we have found in our analysis, not understanding Global Scholar very well at this point, but the conversations I've had with Frederick County, they have similar concerns about the alignment. When we had the TIF grant, we needed something in terms of measurable accountability for teachers. And as we have progressed with the adoption of SLOs, once again, we needed some accountability checkpoint. It has served us well, particularly in the area of reading, I believe, because it's allowed us to measure how well students are reading, how well they're progressing in the area of reading. The math, probably not as significantly been a good measuring point, but now we can see the literacy of our students and make sure that they're progressing at a rate that's satisfactory for the system. So right now, MAP's really served us well for SLOs and accountability, and going to what Dr. Demain, ensuring that great instruction is occurring every day. And as you know, Mrs. Williams, if great instruction is occurring, tests will take care of themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Marco.
Are there other questions? Mrs. Bright?
To that same point, I'm glad you used the word sunset, because that was my question. Do we expect to just have maps forever and ever? And I'm wondering if we're sunsetting, do you see that as we do some sort of internal development of benchmarks, or whatever we want to refer to maps as? Can we develop that internally? That would make it more fluid, more flexible, more reactive as needed, and is there any model for that out in the
Certainly,
world?
I think that's something that we can discuss, creating something among our experts here at Washington County. Yes, I certainly think that's a possibility.
Because if we're waiting for a vendor to catch up to changing standards, and we're paying $200,000 a year for that privilege, if we can do it better and more effectively in-house, and if we have that capability, that seems to make sense. And just briefly on the money, how does the $191,000 compare to the last year? I didn't see a year-to-year cost on this. Is this the same? Has it gone up 10%? Do we?
I think it's very similar. We're purchasing per student, and you can't purchase just a portion of the test. So we can't purchase reading separate of mathematics. I know one conversation we'll have to have is, do we use Agile Minds and map testing for some courses? So we have some things like that we need to look at. Just a quick comment on something you said there just a little bit ago. Originally, we were counting on the state for benchmark material. As you recall, the state all along the way was talking about a 25, 50%, 75% benchmark that'd be optional for counties to use, that'd be 100% aligned with Park. And it wasn't until just in the last couple months that they pretty much have announced that they're no longer going to be doing that, is what I understand. I could be wrong on that.
That's my understanding as well.
But that is what every county has been counting on coming from the state in the original rollout of the Park assessments.
I'm not surprised. I'm not. Back to Park just briefly, I was just reading an article that much of Park and Smart Balance, the two main assessment vendors, are losing their grants to build these assessments, and that, surprise, surprise, they're going to pass that on to the locals, so we'll be paying more per test for those which are mandated. So I'm sure, Dr. Michaels, you're going to tell us the state's going to help us out with that as well.
You won't hear that from me.
Okay. Anyways, sorry, but I appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, one other question. I apologize. I'm hearing some street-level rumors that some students or parents are opting their students out of taking the MAPS test. Are we seeing a trend or an anomaly?
I haven't encountered that in any conversations with principals, but that doesn't mean it hasn't occurred, but it would.
It hasn't come to this level.
I have not heard it, no.
Neither have I.
Okay, I'll share with you offline. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll just say, while we're on the MAP test, as a parent, I like it because it provides me three benchmarks, not benchmarks, that's a term of art, right? 3 indications each year of how my children are doing. I find once you learn how to read them, the score's pretty clear to understand. There's a single score that gives you a sliding scale, but then if you go further under the website, you can find out a whole lot more detail about what each of those means. It gives you a Lexile level for each child, and now after being through it for 3 years, you can put the reports from each child next to each other, and on what is an objective scale, you can watch their progress over a number of years, and I've found that particularly helpful. It may It may be misaligned in some ways, but just from the parent's point of view, I really like it. And if my kids heard me telling you how much I like the MAP tests, they'd not be happy with me, but I think it's been a great tool for me to help monitor my children's progress.
And it's also allowed us not, in the past with our benchmarks, we had some teachers the day before the benchmarks teaching to that benchmark. With the MAPs, you cannot do that. It also allows all our students to interface with technology, which will be a requirement of PARCC. I believe it has really seated us well in terms of making sure that we had the technology capacity to take the assessment across the system. And if we had not explored it, we probably may not be where we are today. So those are all some definite benefits of MAPs that we've had. The last, it's norm referenced across the country, so we can compare ourselves with other districts and other students to see how we're progressing. So it has been a real benefit, I believe, to the system and has positioned us well. Will it eventually run its course? I would say yes.
The August 5th progress report, academic progress report, will include data that shows a ninth grader where they were in eighth grade, how they did in the fall, how they did in the winter, and how they did in the spring, collectively as a group of ninth grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, on the 1185 Lexile score for readiness data. So we'll have a lot of that. Some of that's coming from the MAP data, so we'll share some of that information.
Now, I don't mean to suggest that there's not anything out there that's better. I'm just mean to communicate my personal experience with it. So, other questions on the consent agenda?
Mr. President, I thought I heard, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, one of my colleagues saying that teachers were concerned about this because it was part of an evaluation. Am I hearing that correctly or not?
No, I think what I said was that eventually the SLOs will be tied to or teacher evaluations, not that that was something that was happening currently.
Sorry, I thought you were it was being tied to this test that was being given, this MAPS right now.
No.
Thank you for clarification.
Other questions on the consent agenda? Mrs. Brightman? Is there anything else on the maps?
That's what
Let me just make sure that we've had all those questions answered. Okay, so other topics then.
Number 4. Just really, I guess, a couple curiosity questions on the fresh baked bread. Whole wheat, all grain?
Products, our Food Nutrition Service Department several years ago moved forward with the federal act that requires certain amounts of whole grain and calories and reduction of salt and those types of things, and all these products are in line with that.
I assume the reason we're going outside of the school system capability is cost. Is there any way that we could bake in-house?
To bake bread in-house ourselves. I would have deferred that to Mr. Francesco, but I would think that would be quite an undertaking.
I didn't know if we had the capability, or that was where I was going.
When I was a child, maybe
wanted
what's up
to-
with you, I loved the day we had spaghetti because you knew they were going to have those fresh baked biscuits. Or rolls, I guess they were at the time.
I just know that we're moving into a direction where we're trying to buy local and bake from scratch and cook and do a little bit more of on-site, and I was just curious if there was any plan to
From a
maybe
labor
do...
standpoint, we just couldn't afford
Scale.
to invest the labor into this that we can receive from the vendor.
Okay.
I will
And
point out that all but one item are whole grain, use whole grain flour in production, and the one item that doesn't is wheat. So I think that the specifications have definitely been changed for more nutritious products.
thank you.
Is there other comments on the consent agenda? Can I ask that the contract with Meritus is on the consent agenda. Can you talk through what any of the cost changes are? I know there's been a couple of $100,000 worth of cost changes from last year. If you could help the board and the public understand what is driving that. I think at some point in the future, maybe we'd like to have a report more broadly on the student health program and what we've learned from having done this, but as far as the contract's concerned,
I think our most significant cost change have been the addition of 2 staff members. I know there's been a change in benefits from 28% to 30% on their side. There's been a slight pay increase that, across a number of employees, a large portion of this is salaries, has driven some of the cost, and then a little bit of administrative fee, but I'll defer to Mike.
No, those were all correct. We've had salary increase, I believe, both years, multiple years for Meritus staff that have mirrored somewhat of what WCPS employees have received. As the contract grows, administrative fees are going to grow with it in terms of the percentage. And then the other factor would be adding 2 staff members, and it's actually adding 1 staff member. Meritus is assuming a position that is currently funded by our general balance, so that money will come back to us in terms of, so it'll be 1 new staff position while we'll gain money back to our general budget because Meritus is assuming it. And historically, Meritus has been $200,000 less than what's been the anticipated cost over the 3 years of working with Meritus. So we've not quite exhausted the entire budget over the 3 years that Meritus has partnered with Washington County Public Schools.
so this is a not-to-exceed type contract where we receive invoices based on services provided,
That is correct, Dr. Hardy.
and what you're saying is in the last couple of years, it's come in less than the contract that's approved,
Correct.
just so it's clear to the people watching. Not that you weren't clear, Dr. Marco. And what are the new, the one new position you said is not a new position, it's the same. What's the other new position for? Is that?
Right now, we're looking at 2 schools that have had significant spikes in health room visits and determining which one would be best served for the additional staff member.
Great. Are there any other questions, Mrs. Brightman?
I know recently we've all heard about the merger with, I think it's Frederick Emeritus in Western Maryland. Do we see any difference or any problem or issues with how that might affect this contract or different service levels, different capabilities? Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I would think it would be nice to have an annual report. I know that it's important to know what the trend lines are for health care for our students, and I know that's of concern to the community. When we changed this over from the health department in the county 3 years ago, that the community was concerned that we were showing proper oversight and due diligence, so I think it's important to continue the conversation.
Any other questions? If not, the question's on Mr. Bailey's motion to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Personnel action is next on the agenda.
Dr. Hardings, excuse me, members of the board. As discussed earlier in closed session, there are several personnel actions for your review and consideration.
Is there a motion to approve the personnel actions recommended by staff?
I so move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Mrs. Williams and second by Mr. Bailey to approve personnel actions. Is there any discussion? If not, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? Motion passes 7-0, and the student member abstains. Thank you. Reports to the board. Mr. McHose, anything from student government?
Nothing at this time.
Mrs.
Nothing at this time.
Mrs. Harshman, curriculum?
The Curriculum and Instruction Committee will meet August 26th at 11:15 in the board conference room, and perhaps we'll have some information on the map and the correlation at that time.
Mrs. Williams, finance?
Yes, there's been a change in the date of the upcoming Finance Committee meeting. We are now going to meet on Wednesday, July 23rd at 1 o'clock in the Finance Conference Room.
Thank you. Mrs. Fisher, policy review and development?
Yes, Policy Committee met July 2nd and discussed the 4 policies that we dealt with earlier today. We also discussed at length Policy JK, advertising in schools. We made a number of changes to this very outdated policy, and we're going to continue to work with that, hopefully to finish it for moving on for first read at our first August meeting. We also touched on KLB, another very outdated policy dealing with public complaints about curriculum or instructional materials. We're going to be looking at that again at our next meeting and possibly combining it with some related policies. Mrs. Brown kindly summarized for our group the work of the Policy Committee for the first 6 months of this year. In that 6 months, we've reviewed 24 policies. 2 of those were very significant policies that required quite a lot of time, those being the policy setting policy and the student discipline policy. We've adopted 2 policies, updated 1, rescinded 6, and we have, after today's action with those 4 items, we have 12 policies left that are in various stages at this time. Our next meeting is July 23rd, which is not our normal day. It is a Wednesday. And I believe we start at 10:30, I believe is when we start.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Bailey, Facilities.
Yes, Mr. President. The Facilities Committee will be meeting in August. We've been in recess during the June and July summer break. One of the topics that we will have on the next agenda will be looking at the Washington County Technical High School, its functionality, space available, lack of space, whatever concerns that might occur there. And we will be getting construction updates among many other things that we will report back on the next meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Mr. Ridenhour, Human Resources.
The HR Committee will be meeting next Tuesday, the 22nd, at 10 a.m. in the board conference room.
Thank you. And Committee on Orientation Ad Hoc.
Yeah, the ad hoc committee met this morning. It was our 3rd meeting at 7:30. Reviewed a draft version of a new policy, BIA, looked at some regulations, made suggestions, compared with orientation offerings from MABE, and set our next meeting for August 5th at 7:30.
Thank you. Anything from MABE Conference Planning? Anything from other MABE committees, Board of Directors?
Board of Directors meets tomorrow morning.
Anything else from any other committees? Okay, that brings us to future agenda items. A reminder that we will be having a work session on August 5th to discuss student achievement data, HSA and MSA, and other related data mapped from the school year that's just completed. We won't have SAT, ACT, or AP results in yet, so we'll schedule a discussion to discuss those at a business meeting sometime late summer or early fall. A reminder to everyone as well, we will be meeting on Thursday with Urban Partners at the City Council's chambers at 3 o'clock, and then have a joint meeting with the Mayor and Council of Hagerstown to discuss the Downtown Academic Hub at 4 o'clock on Thursday of this week. I think that's all for future agenda items. That brings us to board member comments. Mr. McHose? Mrs. Harshman?
Nothing at this time.
Mrs. Williams?
Just a thank you to my colleagues for tolerating my missteps this afternoon.
No
I think
worries.
it happens to all of us from time to
worries.
time, and I appreciate your tolerance.
No worries. Mrs. Brightman?
Nothing this evening. No, it's just great to see the enthusiasm and preparation for the process, so thank you.
Mrs. Fisher?
I have nothing.
Mr. Bailey?
I have nothing today.
Mr. Ridenhour?
Nothing at this time.
I just have one, and I'll be brief. A few minutes ago, we approved personnel actions, and one of the actions on that list was approving the separation from Washington County Public Schools of Dr. Marco. It's, I think, sad for many of us to see him go. His passion and commitment to this school system, I think, has been an inspiration to many of us. One of the things that I think of when I think of Mike that probably people out in the public don't see is, he's a built guy. He clearly works out, looks like a real tough guy, plays flag football. Sports analogies are pretty common around here. But for those who know him and have worked with him, he has a real, and staff will probably make fun of him because I say this, but he has a real soft spot for those kids among us who have the greatest challenges. And I think that goes back to when he was at Western Heights, his initial certification in special education, his moving up through the chain of leadership in Washington County, which took him through the special education department. You see Mike come alive and really, his passion really come out when you're talking about special ed kids and other kids who face great challenges. So on behalf of the board, I'd like to thank you, Mike, for your years of service here. I wish you all the best in Frederick County, where I'm sure you will do fantastic. And again, thank you. I think we're a better school system because of your service here. If there's no further business before the board, I declare the meeting adjourned. Thanks, everyone.